Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, the Package Tourist and the magical mystery tour called life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is author John Rees. John lives in New Hope, Pennsylvania, and has been writing for the past 39 years about the experiences and material culture of common soldiers and women in the armies of the American Revolution. In 2019, his first book, They Were Good Soldiers, African Americans Serving in the Continental Army, from 1775 to 1783 was released, and at exactly 1 week from today, his second book, Don Troiani's Black Soldiers in America's Wars, 1754 to 1865, where John collaborates with renowned military researcher and painter Don Troiani, will be released. Tonight, we will be celebrating John's writing career. John, it's an honor and privilege to have you on the show, and welcome aboard.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
I'd like to start off by asking you, John, please tell our listeners about your collaboration with Don Troiani. Did he seek you out, or did you seek him out when you two started working on this book?
Well, I first met Don in the 90s. I went up with a friend to pose for a painting. And I'd been doing living history since about 10 years before that. So, and I've continued to pose for him over the years, got to know him a bit better. And he called me one day in I guess it was August 2022, and he asked me if I'd be interested in doing the book on the subject that the title of the book tells about. And at first, I kind of hesitated because my chosen expertise is the American Revolution, and that goes far beyond the Revolution. So I hesitated, and after about a month, he called me back, and I knew I had to do it.
Okay, so it was a 2 year. It took about 2 years to create this book?
Well, it actually took about. For me, it took about a little less than a year.
Okay.
And because we didn't sign the contract until I think it was October of 2022. We both got advances for the book, and most of my advance, or a large portion of my advance, went towards research books. And then I spent a good part of the time until the beginning of the year, and probably even in January, just doing some preliminary research and trying to think out how I wanted to handle the narrative.
Okay.
So, yeah, it was an intense. Well, it was actually less than 9 months with vacation and the back operation, and another month given over to finishing some other projects I had done.
How did the collaboration take place? Would you write a passage and then he would create an illustration out of a passage, or was it vice versa? How would you describe the artistic interaction between you two?
Well, basically, Don came up with the idea. Don had already done some individual figures of black soldiers of a lot of time periods, but especially in the Revolution. So he already had some done, and some of those had been published already, but he decided to do more for the book. And basically, he would send me images, and I would, his one stipulation was that I do a 900 word, as close as possible to a 900 word caption for each image. So there were, actually there were 47 images. I actually did 43 captions because some of the images share a caption. So that, I'm used to doing like short pieces and trying to compact as much as possible into a small amount of words. But it was rather interesting for me. But it actually worked out pretty well because whenever I was done a caption, and sometimes he would give me some stuff he wanted me to focus on. But whenever I was done a caption, I would send it to him, and he would basically look at it and okay it, or not okay it. And that actually worked out pretty well because from the first, pretty much, he had very few changes for the captions that I sent him. And he's not an easy guy to get past.
Ooh, okay. Okay. Now let's talk about, okay, what were the backgrounds of America's first black soldiers? I mean, were they slaves? Were they immigrants from abroad? Were they freedmen? What exactly led them to serve and fight for America?
Well, they were all of the above. They were enslaved soldiers. There were free soldiers. There were some men who had previously been slaves, and it's rather interesting because the enslaved men really often had no choice on whether they chose to fight, and in that it's actually very similar to the American Revolution. Now, it's also a little bit complicated too, because you're looking at the men who fought for New France in French and Indian War, for the British in the American Revolution, and the Germans and the French in the American Revolution. And so we weren't just covering America's black soldiers, but we were also covering the soldiers of the armies, black soldiers of the armies that fought in America's wars during that 111-year period. And again, that was also a mixed bag. I mean, some of these soldiers had been born in Africa and came across when they were young, with their mother or their father. And what led them to fight, as I said, the enslaved men really had little choice. But during the Revolution, for the American Army, the enslaved men that did fight, they were either promised their freedom at the end of their service, and that promise was by and large kept. There are some instances where they weren't freed right away, and in some states where, such as Virginia, they were not promised their freedom. But in 1785, post-war, legislation was passed that gave the freedom to black men who had served America during the war. And that didn't just include soldiers, but it also included men who worked in the salt mines and other production facilities that were basically serving the war.
Okay. Now, when you were doing your research, did you uncover any type of social-political consciousness from these soldiers, these brave men and women who served? I mean, did you find any writings where they would leave their thoughts or anything like that? Was there any type of a social-political consciousness?
Well, early on, in the French and Indian War, there really were no writings that the black soldiers themselves left behind. As you came into the American Revolution, they didn't leave writings that they wrote during the war, but they wrote post-war, usually in the 19th century. Some of them left memoirs.
Okay.
Of their service. There's not many of them, but the ones that are there are really interesting.
Okay.
As you get closer to up to the mid 19th century in the American Civil War, then you have letters from soldiers who fought for the Union Army during the war. As far as the socio-political consciousness, I mean, they were, especially the free blacks, and to a certain extent, the enslaved blacks, especially the ones who were serving probably in a household rather than being, working out in the fields. They probably had some kind of, starting from the French and Indian War and into the American Revolution, they probably had some kind of a consciousness of what was going on politically. And I'm very sure that they were aware of Declaration of Independence. With the wording in that, they heard about Lord Dunmore's Ethiopians fighting in Virginia in 1775 and 1776, and how they were offered their freedom. They were, they kept their ears open, and they were probably more or less pretty well informed.
Okay. How did America's white soldiers perceive the early African American soldiers during the French and Indian Wars up to the Revolution and later? What was the white soldiers' perception of them?
Well, early on, it's not that easy to know. But if we can base the what happened in the French and Indian War on what we know of the American Revolution, especially in the American or the Continental Army, everything I've seen for black Continental soldiers, they were treated It's pretty much the same as the white soldiers in the Army, well, the white and Indian soldiers in the Army. They were given the same rations, they were given the same clothing, the same pay, and in all my research, I've found no real treatment beyond the fact that early in the war, probably in the first 2 years of war, black soldiers were taken out probably for fatigue duties. On some occasions, not generally, but on some occasions, that pretty much stopped by mid-war, by the third year.
Okay.
And the relations between officers and the enlisted men, white enlisted men with the black soldiers, was pretty equitable.
Okay. Now, the book only goes up to 1865. Can we envision a sequel for this book from you and Don Troiani?
Well, I mean, on Don's part, I wouldn't think so, because I don't think he's really done a whole lot beyond or past the Civil War. He's done a few. I think he's done a few of maybe the Indian Wars, but basically he's focused on the Civil War and back to the 18th century.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons. Since it only does go to 1865, I included a reading list at the back of the book.
Okay.
That actually takes you up to the 1970s, the Vietnam War, and I basically focus on the North American continent. So that includes the American Army and also Canadian forces.
Okay. Please tell John. Please tell our audience about your first book. They Were Good Soldiers. Please tell our audience about that.
Sure. I'd say probably about 2005, 2008 or 10, I started writing some articles on black soldiers in the Continental Army. And it was based on research that I had come across over the years doing work on other things. It's basically the way I've worked since I first started writing and researching in the mid-'80s. I would be working on one subject, but I would come across material on other subjects, and I would just set it aside. So by about 2008, I had enough to have at least a small article. The first article was rather crude, and the second article was actually a lot lengthier, more in depth. And the second article, the first was basically an overview. The second article was on black soldiers serving in Southern Continental regiments, of which, despite what many people might think, there were actually quite a few. And that I posted on LinkedIn. An editor saw that and asked me if I wanted to do an article on either that subject or any other subject I I could think of. And I decided to write on black soldiers. And basically, it focuses on the Continental Army. And I have an overview in the beginning. I actually have an overview of British service, black soldiers, British service, and loyal service. And then I have an overview of blacks in the Continental Army. And from there, I have a chapter on numbers based on a 1778 return. And then the other chapters are split up into state-by-state coverage of black soldiers who served in each state.
Okay.
And then I have a couple chapters where I close out. I follow some of the men post-war and find out what happened to them and their families after the war. And then the appendices, I have black soldiers serving as waiters during the war. And actually, it was just as common for a white soldier to serve as a waiter to an officer or a servant to an officer as it was for a black soldier during the Revolution.
All right.
And then I have a small piece on black women following the armies, something which I actually wrote more about after the book and expanded on that.
Okay. What led you to pursue the African American experience during America's earliest wars?
Well, I was curious about it. I mean, there were very few good books about it. There were some bicentennial books, not that many in number, or even some of the ones that were not really good history. Some of them were actually quite good though, but not very long. I had read George Quarles's. Oh God, I can't remember Mr. Qualls' first name, but he wrote the Negro in the American Revolution about 1962.
Okay.
I read that in the 80s, and that's actually an overview of black service in the American Revolution for the Germans, the British, what they experienced in civilian life. So that actually still is, despite being written in 1962, it's still a really good book. It has some mistakes, but you know, any history book that's written, you know, in an earlier period, or any history book written now is going to have mistakes found later, just because of new research.
Okay.
And you know, I started finding more and more information, and it just seemed like a subject that was taking to be written about. And I mean, with all my work, I have over 200 articles on the period. Most of which are available online. And with all my work, it's just been curiosity. You know, I'll think about a subject, or I'll have a question about a certain subject, and I'll just start doing some research, and just followed my own interests and curiosity. And luckily, there are at least a few other people that are interested in what I've written.
Are you apprehensive that not only African American history, but all forms of non-white history are being shunned aside by internal political forces?
Well, I think in some areas of the U.S., yes, that's being done, and I think that that's eventually going to change. I mean, walking around in life with blinders on, even when it comes to history, is not a good thing to do. I mean, if you don't recognize your own history, and you're not willing to recognize history that you may think is shameful, and it actually was shameful in some instances, just because you don't want to feel bad about it. It's not a really enlightened way of thinking, and it's not good for the young people that are growing up, and it's not good for the adults that as I said, go around with blinders on.
Agreed. Yeah. Let's talk about yourself now. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, not too far from Washington's Crossing, Pennsylvania. My family has lived in Pennsylvania. Somebody asked me that question some years ago, how long has my family been in Pennsylvania? And both sides of the family, when they came over, they basically came to Pennsylvania and stayed. And in one instance, part of the family came over just after William Penn in the 1680s.
Ooh, okay. Yeah. So, they go back a ways then. Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's just interesting that they none of them really ventured out of Pennsylvania.
Okay. All right. Now, where did you go to college, and also what led you to become a writer?
Well, I didn't go to college. Well, actually, I didn't get a degree. I didn't go to college when I was younger. I took some courses in the early 2000s, enjoyed it, but at that point, I was pretty entrenched in a career that, while it paid the bills, it wasn't. It didn't revolve around writing or anything really interesting. But it did pay the bills, so I really didn't pursue the degree after taking about 4 courses, just because it just didn't seem to make sense. But along the way, I've been an avid reader since I was pretty young, and beginning in the 90s, I was fortunate enough to have 3 or 4 people who served as, they were friends, but they were also mentors for my writing. And a couple of them would actually go through my writing in the 90s and mark it up in red and, just give comments. And instead of, taking that as an insult, I realized it for what it was a compliment, because they were willing to take the time, because it's not easy to edit a paper, to take the time and tell me how to become a better writer. And one of those early things was to go from the passive voice into the active voice. And so I'm partly self-taught, and I'm partly been educated by friends, some of whom are academics.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier you're a Revolutionary War reenactor. What is your regiment and what role do you play? And tell our listeners, what's the experience like and what battles have you reenacted during your reenacting career?
Well, it's been pretty varied. I mean, I started in 1984. I think I was in my 30s then. Just because I was originally interested in the Civil War, because at that point the Civil War was really heating up. And I eventually ran into a revolutionary unit at a local event and just joined them. But what I found was that some people could give me information, and some people could tell me what the source was. Others gave me information, but they couldn't tell us, what the source was. I found out later that some of the information was not good information, and the unit we were portraying at that point, nobody really knew anything about the unit. They had chosen to do this Pennsylvania unit, but nobody really knew the history of it. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do a small paper on it, which turned out to be my first writing. It was never published; it's online now, but never published anywhere. And I started doing research on what the unit would wear and what they carried, and I took that back to the unit, and they didn't want to use the information. So eventually, I just started joining other units and had some good experiences, and eventually I joined a British unit, the 40th Regiment Light Infantry, which is out of New England, but now they have members pretty much all over the Eastern Seaboard. And then where I am now and where I've been for probably the last 20 years is I really don't belong to a unit. I mean, I pretty much can pick a unit that I want to go. I ask somebody if I can attend an event, or a lot of times I'm asked to attend an event, and so I've been able to have a lot of really great experiences that way. Okay. The battle reenactments, when you're first in the hobby, that's what you're excited about. But as you're in the hobby longer, and luckily there's a lot of young people now with the same mindset, you're interested in events that will give you more of an experience and give you at least some opportunity to educate the public, or at least talk with the public and answer questions. And some of those have been pretty immersive, including in 2015 and 2017 we did a real-time march from Trenton to Princeton on or near January 3rd, which would have been the Battle of Princeton. Yeah. So we were recreating the march of the Pennsylvania Associator Company under Charles Wilson Peel, from the Second Battle of Trenton overnight to Princeton battlefield, where the Battle of Princeton took place. So we cooked during the day before. We slept in the barracks in Trenton. We got up we took to the road about 1:30 in the morning, and then marched the original route to the battle. And then the first time we did it, we basically went through the motions of Peel's company: advancing, firing, retreating, reforming, advancing, firing, just as a demonstration for the public. And the second time, we actually had opponents, friends of ours, some of whom originally participated in the first march. They formed the 17th Regiment, which was the actual British regiment at the Battle of Princeton. So they actually were our opponents at that point. Okay. But it was more, for us and for the participants, it was more the experience of the march. It was more the experience of, seeing how long it would take us, what it was like marching overnight with not very much sleep. Yeah. And there's been a few other events like that that have been the best experience I've had.
John, whenever I interview an author, I always love to ask this standard question: who were your favorite authors when you were growing up? And of those favorite authors, did any of them inspire you to become a writer, or perhaps influence your personal writing style?
Well, I mean, like I said, I've always been an avid reader, so my personal writing style, I basically just took from unconsciously just started writing, and I'm sure I took that writing style from all the books I'd read up to that point. And as I said, that was my mid-30s. But the first real author that I remember really loving was Kurt Vonnegut, and that was probably at least late middle school and early high school. And I mean, I've always loved history, and I had read some novels, but Vonnegut really pushed me toward fiction. Excuse me. Yeah. And I've loved fiction ever since. So now I read poetry, fiction, nonfiction. I pretty much read it all.
Okay.
And still love Vonnegut.
Okay. Please tell our listeners, where can readers find your books?
Right now, they should be able to find them in many of the larger bookstores. I mean, it's on Amazon. I know Barnes & Noble will be carrying it. Our local bookstore here in New Hope, Pennsylvania will be carrying it, Farley's Books. I mean, I don't know how many of the smaller, owner-run bookstores will carry it. But I know it'll be generally available.
Okay.
And probably pretty easily available, too.
Okay. Last question. What is your next book project, and when can we expect its release?
That I don't know. I've thought about different. In fact, before Don asked me, I was thinking of different subjects. But to do a book, I have to really. First of all, I have to make sure it's okay with my wife, because it's a big investment. It's a big time investment and a big attention investment. So I don't go into a book lightly. But I have a couple subjects. So one would be to possibly do a book with material that didn't make it into this book because it had to be cut out because of length constrictions. And that would be on some of the black units and lesser known units for the fighting for the French, the Spanish, the Continental Army, and possibly expand it from there. And another subject would be to do a book on women with the Continental Army, not in a fighting role, but in a support role. What their lives are like, what their duties are like, how they got there. Look a little bit at civilian life and what the economy was like, and why those women would have gone into the Army. But right now, I'm just focusing on getting this book out and trying to. I have some presentations already, and I'm pretty sure I'll be getting some more.
Okay. John, I want to thank you so much for appearing on the show, and I wish you the best luck in your future writing endeavors, okay?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
You take care, all right?
Okay, you too. Thanks a lot, Matthew.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for my next show where I will be interviewing historian Mark Van Els. Thank you and good night.